Starfield's little corner of the galaxy is clearly far too big for any one player to ever see everything. So how is it possible then that the game's world can regularly feel weirdly small? The more time you spend exploring the settled systems, the more this strange dichotomy becomes clear. The huge number of procedurally generated explorable planets are frequently at odds with the massive amount of handcrafted content. At times, Starfield does get the balance just right, and specific settlements or encounters build off the game's sense of scale to emphasize isolated human struggles with memorable gameplay moments. But far too often, it feels like these two aspects of Starfield's world are fighting one another. Most games are guided by creative visions and budget limitations to focus their scope and give the player just a small chunk of a wider world to explore. Skyrim is focused on Skyrim, and Fallout New Vegas is focused on New Vegas. But Starfield, on the other hand, seems to present almost its entire established world to the player. And while that's exciting in a few ways, it has some disappointing side effects too. Starfield lets you climb every mountain and discover what lies beyond those boundaries. But unfortunately, finding out that there's nothing there to discover feels a lot worse than being prevented from going there in the first place. Sometimes simply knowing that there are more stories and more lives out there beyond the edges of the game is what gives meaning to the scope of the world and its drama. So by presenting the player with access to everything in the settled systems, Starfield creates an odd dichotomy of scale. So how does this unbalanced contrast materialize in the game's major settlements? Where in Starfield can you find examples that succeed wholeheartedly in combining intimate encounters with the galactic scale? And why exactly is it that Starfield can sometimes feel both too big and too small?
Hope you're not looking to cause any trouble in that costume of yours.
Starfield's world map is obviously huge. With over 100 systems and 1,000 planets, you could conceivably spend many thousands of hours exploring this galaxy in a single playthrough. That being said, most of the space that the player is technically able to explore is essentially empty, and the percentage of this gigantic map that the majority of players will want to actually see is pretty small. That doesn't have to be an inherently bad thing, of course, because there is, for some more than others, value in that empty space. It's probably a little unfair to even call it empty space, when really what I'm referring to are the vast expanses of on-planet procedurally generated landscapes, each with a smattering of flora, fauna, random encounters, and pre-built structures sprinkled across their surface. The inclusion of all this optional extra space may have been seen by some at Bethesda as the secret ingredient to making a single-player game almost endlessly replayable. And for those who particularly enjoy this aspect of Starfield, that might prove out. But for many, like myself, it feels like there would be more to see in the game if there was a lot less stuff in the world, and that stuff was more often between major locations rather than far away from them. Obviously, seeing the same structures over and over in Starfield can get tiresome, but I think that the real problem with the procedurally generated planets across the galaxy is not that they're excessively boring to explore, it's that they're not well integrated as part of the journey. And so instead they become a disappointing destination. I know that some people like to suggest that every single building that fills out the map of a game like Fallout 3 is full of unique loot, interesting NPCs, and handcrafted stories. But that's just not the whole truth. There is a lot of that, but as much as I love Fallout 3, I'm willing to admit that I spent many hours in the wasteland exploring tunnels and shacks, only to find some extra ammo and Nuka-Cola if I was lucky. But the difference was that in Fallout 3, I was almost always exploring on my way to something. All of the generic locations in Starfield provide some random gear and fun gameplay moments in the exact same way, but they're integrated into the gameplay loop very differently. I am pretty sure that Starfield wants the player to explore these locations as they travel between planets with major settlements and handcrafted quests. Sort of like an empty planet is a random shack between Megaton and Tenpenny Tower. But the problem is that the added steps and the quirks of the system don't incentivize most players to actually play the game like that. These random locations are very far apart, and when the player identifies that almost none of them are going to offer unique quests or interactions, it's difficult to know where to start and stop your exploration. It's not guided in the same way that Fallout 3 is, where between this quest giver and this marker you feel encouraged to explore whatever's there, and maybe find something unique and interesting. Starfield's feeling of discovery comes more often, I think, from landing on new planets or being hailed by a random ship. And while that is unique and good in its own right, it leaves these random locations without the same obvious role. I think a lot more players would happily check out Starfield's abandoned research stations if they were found along their route from one quest location to another. But instead, these prefabricated structures are spread far and wide and are never quite interesting enough on their own to necessarily warrant the journey when you have a million quest markers pointing you elsewhere. There are a few noteworthy random encounters you might be able to find on the surfaces of planets, but it goes without saying that this whole system would also be enormously improved if these encounters were a lot more consistently engaging and rewarding. And it would also help if the prefabbed locations had a more meaningful connection to the game's storytelling. A significant portion of them are occupied by space pirates, and are usually research facilities abandoned by the United Colonies or the Freestar Collective after the Colony War, which is interesting once or twice but not 50 times. The surfaces of settled planets replete with abandoned refineries and solar farms very quickly blend together as a sort of generic wilderness of often unrewarding exploration. It quickly becomes obvious to the player that out beyond the boundaries of known settlements on any planet, there is little more to find than empty space and spacers camping out in deserted outposts. And these random structures are even weirder when they're connected to the game's quest hub settlements, like the Jewel of the United Colonies, New Atlantis.
At the end of the day, you must feel comfortable in what you wear. If it speaks to you, what anyone else thinks doesn't matter.
New Atlantis is the first major settlement that the player is introduced to in Starfield's main quest, and it is a fascinatingly weird and unique place. The city is essentially split into three major sections, with the spaceport at ground level, the well in the basement, and the expansive courtyard and shopping district surrounding the mast building on the upper floor. There is just about every kind of merchant you could possibly want here, and there are a huge number of quest givers and distractions to be found too. This place was proudly touted before launch as the biggest city Bethesda have ever made. And while that may be true, there is a very obvious and weird problem with New Atlantis. That being its all too obvious boundaries. While you're exploring your shopping or dining options or catching up with the folks at the lodge, everything seems fine and dandy. But if you ever happen to reach the outer limits of the city, you'll notice something peculiar. Outside of New Atlantis, Jemison is a barren wasteland. Yes, there are a few farms and research stations, but when you look at the city from afar or up above, it's almost like there's a big invisible dome over New Atlantis, marking out the only area where citizens are allowed to live, work, or shop. Honestly, it might have been better if there was an actual dome over the city and no breathable air outside, because at least that would make some sense. As it stands though, instead, New Atlantis looks to be some kind of dystopian urban planning nightmare. It seems utterly bizarre that no one has expanded beyond the city limits. But the key thing to note here is that it's not bizarre because New Atlantis is the size that it is and ends where it does. It's bizarre because the game invites you to explore beyond its boundaries, even though there's very little of note to find there. If this New Atlantis city map had been the only map on Jemison, with maybe a tiny bit of the outside included, then the player wouldn't have to give it a second thought. It would just appear that this is the map, this is the game, this is where everything happens, and there's probably more civilization somewhere beyond it. Most open world games use the same old simple tricks to tell the player where their world begins and ends. If you can see it on the map, you can go there, and usually some giant mountains or vast open oceans will keep you caged inside. But Starfield doesn't put mountains in the player's way. It invites you to go just about anywhere you like, and while that's brilliant for player freedom, it can feel misleading and disappointing if the player's expectations aren't set right. When you understand that a game like No Man's Sky is primarily a survival game, you're not going to be disappointed when you land on yet another planet and discover there are no handcrafted quests. But while Starfield has several features in common with No Man's Sky, they are all contained within a package where they are not the priority, which changes player expectations drastically. If you went into Starfield expecting a blank canvas, survival-focused world, you'd probably enjoy all of that, as well as being pleasantly surprised by the inclusion of a great many story quests. But if you expect a classic open-world Bethesda map, then you'll be deeply confused when you wander away from Aquila City and find very little, because Aquila City definitely exemplifies the same problem as New Atlantis, feeling like a city jammed into the middle of a wasteland. They probably do justify its isolation slightly better than New Atlantis by building a wall around the settlement to keep everyone safe from the Ashtar outside, but it still feels a bit odd that these independent Wild West settlers don't want to spread out at least a little. Truthfully, the handcrafted and procedurally generated elements just don't usually gel together especially well in Starfield's world. The game's many temples usually feel out of place on a planet, and it's especially odd when there's a research station close by that has apparently just ignored the floaty magic structure. Planets with and without major settlements can be full of structures with no logical explanation for why they're so spread out. And while planets without human inhabitants do at least feel interesting as an opportunity to explore a mostly untouched world, they still feel like a tremendous tonal shift in the game. Just like it's strange stepping out of a bustling city and immediately finding yourself in a barren wasteland, it can feel unusual bouncing between many of these planets. While I do enjoy space combat in Starfield, these flying segments in combination with an excessively busy star map also contribute to the occasional feeling that you're playing several different games one after the other, and that puts the onus on the player to really role play and draw these worlds and features together in their mind. If Fallout 3 is a well-curated open world, then Starfield is an expansive, unrefined one, which requires the player to curate their story according to their own tastes, and that has its upsides and downsides. downsides. The biggest problem is simply that it takes some time before it is obvious to the player exactly where and why the contrasts between its handcrafted quest hubs and procedurally generated content can hurt how it feels to play the game. That said, there are some interesting locations in Starfield which largely avoid these tonal shifts and the perils of the dichotomy of scale.
I saw another group of tourists making their way outdoors, ripe for scaring. Want to help me out again?
There is one location in Starfield that provides an interesting example of how the game's settlements feel without the surrounding wasteland, that being Neon. Owing to its placement on a planet covered in water, you cannot explore the rest of the surface even if you want to. Well, you can, I guess, but it's going to be a very long, boring swim. Either way, the game is pretty clearly telling the player here that everything of interest is inside this city, and you need not bother with the surrounding area, and I think that's great. It's unfortunate that it's the most loading screen heavy city in the game, but I still like Neon a lot, and I like how the whole location is set up as more of a classic sci-fi RPG hub. It's largish, but it's self-contained and dense with content. I don't love all the content that is here, but on the whole, I think it works as a really nice contrast to the wide open spaces elsewhere in the game, and proves just how much they can damage the thematic integrity of these settlements. That said, I don't think that a wasteland of research facilities beyond the border necessarily has to ruin the experience of Starfield's major and minor locations, so long as everything feels well integrated. My absolute favorite settlement in all of Starfield might well be New Homestead, because everything about this tiny little space village feels authentic and rich with life. This tiny colony on Titan is home to a quaint museum, a struggling Chunks franchise, the galaxy's oldest bar, and a doctor who will pay you money to scare tourists while dressed as a space alien. Basically, it has everything you could possibly want from a random little colony on a backwater moon. The few quests on offer here are mostly great, and every character you can chat with makes up a small but important part of New Homestead's overall story. It's a melancholy but welcoming little settlement which seems almost completely forgotten by the rest of the settled systems. And importantly, it feels incredibly well integrated into its surroundings. Again, there are a couple of spread out buildings here, but the fact that this moon doesn't have a breathable atmosphere means that it's entirely logical that the settlement would be contained mostly to this one interior. At New Homestead, it really seems like the huge scale of the galaxy is at play in a meaningful way. Without that scale, without knowing how big the galaxy is, you wouldn't really understand just how small they feel here. The vast wasteland beyond the borders of this old world sci-fi township is all at once plausible and poignant. I just really love this place, honestly, because it delivers on everything that I personally wanted Starfield to be. Weird little self-contained sci-fi stories grounded in some semblance of reality where everything feels cohesive. And while there are other little settlements like it, none of them are quite as good as New Homestead in my eyes. For many of the same reasons though, I think Cydonia is a great city. It's integrated well into the landscape, and without breathable air, the planet's layout makes sense. Ultimately then, I think the scale of Starfield's slice of the galaxy can work both in the game's favor and against it. It can emphasize the tragic isolation of a tiny settlement in an unrelenting massive universe, and it can make a supposedly advanced city seem weirdly small. Bethesda Game Studios built the technology to procedurally generate as many planets as they wanted, and then it feels like they sort of just pressed go. They were so preoccupied with whether or not they could that they didn't stop to think if they should. Is it possible then that significantly less of the game's empty space would make things better? If they cut the number of visitable planets and moons down to 50, with half of them mostly empty but with random encounters, half with proper settlements, and all with just a single square of land to explore, does that then work better? Would Starfield be improved if it was possible for anyone to explore the entire galaxy? Or would the value of all those barren worlds in making the player and the settlements feel small be lost entirely? Is it worth dealing with the dichotomy of scale to have the option to explore anywhere? Starfield's combination of hundreds of explorable planets with Bethesda's handcrafted worlds was an interesting experiment, and it achieved one thing for sure. I don't feel like I will ever see all of Starfield's galaxy. And while that is kind of an interesting feeling for a game like this, I also know that it's largely because I probably don't want to see every single planet in the game. But then again, without doing so, who knows what secrets could be hiding out somewhere in the galaxy. But how do you feel about the scale of Starfield's world? Would you prefer it bigger or smaller? Let me know in the comments, and please do like and subscribe if you'd like to hear me talk more video games. Otherwise, I'll see you next time around.